She thought she was untouchable. My stepmother spent years weaving the perfect lie, charming my father, seducing his trust, and planning to steal his entire $50 million empire. And she chose my cousin's $3 million wedding as the moment to finish her scheme. But what she didn't know was that I was already watching, already planning. In front of 300 of the most powerful people in the city, I exposed her. And when the truth played out on the big screen, her perfect world shattered in seconds. I still remember the way the evening light fell through the tall windows of our family estate in Los Angeles. It painted the dining room in warm gold, but the air always felt colder than it should. My father, Richard Hale, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, quiet as ever, his silver hair catching the fading sun. He was 65, still sharp but softer than he used to be, and too willing to believe the best in people. Across from him sat Cassandra, his new wife, 48, still beautiful, in a way that made people stare. She used to be a model and now owns an upscale spa in Beverly Hills. Or at least, that was the story she told everyone. I was 29, a trust and estate attorney, and I knew more than I wanted to about people like her. I knew the kind of smile she wore, the kind that never reached the eyes. I watched her pour my father a glass of his favorite Pinot Noir, brushing his hand lightly as she set it down. Her voice sweet and careful as she asked about his day. He smiled, faintly tired from the meetings at Hale Properties, the real estate empire he had built from nothing over 40 years. That empire, worth over $50 million, was the unspoken centerpiece of every conversation in this house, even when no one mentioned it. Dinner felt as it always did since she came into our lives. The clinking of silverware filled the silence between their small talk. I moved food around my plate, half listening as Cassandra praised the new chef she wanted to hire for the spa. My father nodded, indulging her with a patience I once admired, but now found dangerous. I could sense how carefully she worked her way into his trust piece by piece. There was no open hostility between us, not exactly. She smiled at me across the table, asked polite questions about my day at the firm, about the case I had just closed for a client fighting over an inheritance. But beneath the surface of her words, I could feel the quiet tension, the way she measured every move, every word. It was a game to her. And I was just an obstacle she hadn't decided how to deal with yet. After dinner, my father excused himself to his study. Cassandra stayed behind, her eyes following him until he disappeared down the hall. Then she stood gathering her wineglass, moving with that effortless grace she always had. She left the dining room without a word. I stayed a little longer, clearing my own plate. The house was large enough that every sound echoed faintly. I heard her heels click softly against the marble floor as she walked toward the sitting room. I didn't mean to follow her. I told myself I was just going upstairs, but halfway there I paused. Her voice carried faintly down the hallway. I moved closer, instinct, more than intention. The sliding door to the small lounge wasn't fully closed. I stopped just before it, my breath caught in my chest. Cassandra's tone was nothing like the syrupy sweetness she used with my father. It was cold, sharp, and controlled. She was on the phone with someone. "We can't wait any longer," she said, her voice low but clear. "Everything needs to be finalized before the end of the month. He's getting more tired, more dependent on me. It will be easier now." I froze, my fingers tightening against the edge of the doorway. She paused, listening. Then she spoke again, even colder this time. "Yes. The paperwork. Make sure it's ready. I don't care how you do it, just make it look clean." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. My pulse hammered in my ears. She ended the call, and the silence that followed felt heavier than her voice. I stepped back, careful not to make a sound. I didn't need to hear more. I knew exactly what she was talking about, and I knew I was right never to trust her. But the real fear wasn't for myself. It was for him. For my father, who believed he had found love again in his late years. For the man who thought he was too experienced to ever be deceived. I walked slowly to my room, my mind racing. The walls of the Hale estate suddenly felt smaller, suffocating, like the house itself was holding a secret I couldn't unhear. When I closed my door, I leaned against it and let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I stared at the quiet room, the faint lights of the city shimmering through the window. Something was coming. Something I had to stop before it was too late. The invitation arrived 2 days later, tucked inside a cream-colored envelope with gold trim. My cousin Sophia Reed was getting married, and of course it would be nothing short of a spectacle. I slid the heavy cardstock out and stared at the embossed letters. The wedding would take place at the Valencia Grand, a luxury resort in La Jolla, overlooking the Pacific. The estimated cost had already made its way through the family gossip chain. $3 million for one weekend. Only Sophia could pull that off. I sat on my bed, the letter in my lap, thinking about the last time I had seen her. Sophia was only 26, but had already carved her way into San Diego's elite social circle. She was kind, but she thrived in the world of polished veneers and quiet competitions. I imagined the guest list: politicians, CEOs, old money families who treated weddings as networking events. I was tempted to ignore it to stay in Los Angeles and pretend I was too busy at the firm, but something about Cassandra's call from that night lingered in my head. If she was planning something, if there was a timeline involved, she would need moments like this to make her moves. And I needed to be there. 2 weeks later, I pulled up to the resort. The Valencia Grand was nothing short of breathtaking. White stone walls climbed high against the blue sky, and fountains lined the drive. Uniformed staff guided Bentleys and Ferraris into place. I stepped out of my modest black sedan, feeling like I had walked into a movie I didn't belong in. Inside, the pre-wedding cocktail reception was already buzzing. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of guests, dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits. Waiters weaved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and tiny artfully plated hors d'oeuvres. I recognized a few faces from the news. State senators, the founder of a tech giant, even an actress I had seen on TV just last week. I spotted Sophia across the room in a pale blue silk dress, glowing the way brides do when the world is watching. She saw me and hurried over her heels, clicking softly against the marble floor. "Liv, you made it," she said, hugging me with genuine warmth. I laughed softly, taking in her excitement. Of course I made it. I wouldn't miss this. She started telling me about the rehearsal dinner planned for that night, the private yacht brunch tomorrow, the ceremony itself, that would have a string quartet flown in from Paris. My mind drifted as she spoke, scanning the room out of habit. That was when I saw Cassandra. She was standing near the center of the crowd, draped in a floor-length emerald gown that shimmered under the chandelier light. Her hair was styled in soft waves, makeup flawless. People were gathered around her, laughing at something she had just said. She carried herself like she owned the place. My father stood at her side, smiling in a way I had not seen in years. He looked proud of her. My stomach tightened. Cassandra eventually broke away from the group and came toward me. She kissed my cheek lightly, the scent of her expensive perfume filling the space between us. "Olivia, darling, you look simple but lovely." She smiled as if it were a compliment. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't want to play her game, but she always found a way to draw you in. She glanced around theatrically. "So, have you met anyone here? Surely at your age you must be thinking about settling down. You wouldn't want to end up alone, would you?" Her tone was sweet but edged with steel. I swallowed the irritation rising in my throat. "I'm happy with my life as it is, Cassandra." Her eyes glinted. "Well, that's admirable. But in families like ours, knowing where you stand is everything. Some things can disappear if you're not careful." She let the words hang there just long enough to sting before turning back toward my father, who had been speaking with a group of guests. I exhaled slowly, forcing my jaw to unclench. As I moved through the room, I noticed a man I didn't recognize standing near the corner, speaking quietly with Cassandra. He was sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, his posture confident, almost too confident. I narrowed my eyes. Then I realized where I had seen his face. Mark Hamilton. A high-profile attorney out of New York with a history of questionable probate cases. I had read about him in a professional journal. He had been accused, though never convicted, of manipulating wills for wealthy clients. Their conversation looked casual to anyone who didn't know better, but I saw it. the flicker of a smirk on his lips, the slight nod she gave him. They spoke only for a moment, and then he slipped away toward the balcony. Cassandra stayed where she was, smoothing her dress and glancing around the room to make sure no one noticed. My pulse quickened. Why was Mark Hamilton here? This wasn't coincidence. Cassandra was too careful for coincidence. I moved toward the balcony, pretending to look for some fresh air, but when I got there, he was already gone. Only the ocean stretched out in the distance, waves crashing quietly against the rocks below. When I turned back, I saw Cassandra across the room again. She was laughing softly with my father, her hand on his arm. She looked radiant, like the perfect wife. No one would have believed she was the same woman I heard on the phone that night. Sophia called my name, pulling me from the moment. She wanted me to meet her fiancé's family. I followed her through the crowd, but my mind stayed locked on Cassandra and Mark. Their eyes had said enough. Something was already in motion. I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in a little tighter. I slipped away from the crowd after Sophia introduced me to another group of polished strangers. My head was buzzing, not from the champagne, but from the sight of Cassandra with Mark Hamilton. I stepped outside to the terrace for some air, and that was where I saw Benjamin leaning against the railing. He looked sharp in his tailored navy suit, but his expression was tense, distracted. When he noticed me, he straightened and gave me a faint smile. "Liv, I was hoping I'd catch you. Do you have a minute?" I nodded, curiosity flickering. Benjamin was Sophia's older brother, and we had always been friendly, though not particularly close. He glanced around, making sure no one was near, then motioned toward a quieter corner of the terrace. I followed him, feeling a strange heaviness settle in my chest. "There's something you should know," he said, finally lowering his voice. "I'm not sure if you're aware, but Cassandra's spa business, it isn't doing well." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "She's always talking about expanding, opening new locations." He shook his head. "That's all smoke and mirrors. I know someone who works in finance, and he told me she's sitting on a mountain of debt. Her flagship location in Beverly Hills is losing money fast. She's been quietly meeting with private lenders." The words hit me like a cold splash of water. Benjamin continued, his tone clipped. "Apparently, she's been telling your father that he should restructure the family assets. Something about reducing his stress and making things simpler. I overheard her once. She said it would be better if the properties were transferred to a single owner." My stomach churned. Of course. Change the ownership, make it look like it was to help him. And then she'd have full control. "Do you think he's actually considering it?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. Benjamin hesitated. "I think he trusts her more than he should. And if she's desperate enough, who knows what she'll do to convince him." I felt the railing under my hand, solid and cold. I knew Cassandra was cunning, but hearing it from someone else made it all too real. Before I could respond, movement from the other end of the terrace caught my eye. Cassandra was stepping outside her gown, catching the light as she scanned the space. For just a second, her eyes met mine. Then they shifted to Benjamin. Her expression didn't change, but something flashed there. A spark of curiosity, maybe even suspicion. She gave a small smile, the kind that made your skin prickle, and then turned back inside. Benjamin exhaled quietly. "She saw us talking." I nodded. "She'll be wondering why." "Be careful, Liv." He squeezed my shoulder lightly. "If she thinks you're onto her, she won't hesitate to make a move." I went back inside, my mind spinning. I needed someone I could trust, someone who could help me dig deeper, and I knew exactly who to call. Later that evening, after the cocktail reception ended, I stepped out onto the garden path behind the resort and dialed Ethan. He picked up on the second ring, his familiar calm voice grounding me. "Liv, hey. How's the wedding chaos? I didn't waste time. I think Cassandra is planning something. I saw her talking with Mark Hamilton tonight. Do you remember him, the attorney from New York with the shady probate cases?" "Yeah. What's he doing there?" "Exactly. I need your help. Can you come down here? I'll be there by morning," he said without hesitation. True to his word. The next day, Ethan arrived at the resort. He was the same as always, composed, but focused, his gray suit crisp, even after the drive from Los Angeles. We met in a quiet lounge off the lobby. "So tell me everything," he said, pulling out his laptop. I explained it all. Cassandra's late-night phone call, seeing her with Mark Hamilton, Benjamin telling me about the spa debt, and her pressure on my father to transfer assets. Ethan's brow furrowed as he listened. If she's desperate, that makes her dangerous. And if Hamilton is involved, it's serious. He opened his laptop. "Let's see if I can find anything about her recent movements. Emails, appointments, anything." I watched as his fingers moved swiftly over the keys. Within minutes, he had pulled up a shadow of Cassandra's digital trail. There were encrypted messages, recent flights to New York, and several calendar entries that looked deliberately vague. Then he paused. "Here, tomorrow night, meeting with MH at the Valencia Grand. That has to be Mark Hamilton." My chest tightened. "So she's meeting him here. During the wedding weekend." Ethan nodded. "That can't be coincidence. It's the perfect cover. All the attention is on Sophia, no one would suspect a thing." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it sinking in. She was making her move now. Ethan looked up at me. "Liv, we can't let her get ahead of us. I'll dig deeper. If there's a paper trail, I'll find it." I hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I trusted Ethan. He had always been there for me long before any of this. "All right, let's find out exactly what she's planning," I said. As we stood to leave, I caught a glimpse of Cassandra through the glass doors of the lobby. She was gliding toward the elevator, her phone pressed to her ear, her face serene. But her eyes shifted slightly, locking on mine for just a heartbeat. I felt it again. That quiet warning. She knew I was watching. Ethan and I met later that night in my suite. The heavy curtains were drawn tight, and the only light came from the glow of his laptop on the table. He had already set up his equipment, cables and devices neatly arranged in a way that made the whole thing feel more like a covert operation than a simple search for answers. I paced the room as he typed, his focus unshakable, his expression unreadable. I could hear the faint sound of the waves outside, the muffled music from the wedding party still going on below. Every detail felt sharper than it should, like my senses were tuned too high. Ethan finally looked up. "I'm in." I froze. "In where?" "Her personal email. Cassandra's. She uses a secured account, but not secured enough." I walked over to the table and leaned over his shoulder. The inbox looked polished and ordinary at first glance, but Ethan was already pulling deeper, finding archived messages and hidden folders. He clicked one marked simply, "Finance." My stomach tightened. The first set of documents he opened were bank transfers. Large amounts wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The recipient names were vague shell companies. Ethan scrolled further, his voice low. "These transfers go back months. She's been moving money steadily." I felt my throat go dry. "How much?" He glanced at the numbers. "Millions. Maybe 5, maybe more. Enough to empty accounts without raising alarms right away." I couldn't look away from the screen. These weren't just random withdrawals. This was structured, planned. He clicked another file. This one was a PDF. It took a second to load, and when it did, my blood went cold. It was a draft of a will. My father's name was there, his signature at the bottom. But it wasn't his. Not really. I knew his handwriting better than anyone. This was a careful imitation, close but not exact. My hand gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "She's forging it," I whispered, my voice shaking. Ethan nodded slowly. "This version leaves the majority of Hale properties to her. Only small, insignificant amounts are left to you." I stepped back, my chest heavy. I could picture my father sitting in his study, completely unaware that the woman he trusted most was preparing to erase me, to take everything he had built. "I can't believe this," I muttered. "I knew she was dangerous, but this—" Ethan's voice was calm but firm. "Liv, I need you to stay focused. This is bad, but it's not the end. We have proof now, but we need more. Enough to make it undeniable." I sat down on the edge of the bed, pressing my hands to my face. I felt the weight of it all crushing down, not just the betrayal, but the humiliation of knowing she thought I was too blind to notice. My father had already lost so much. If she succeeded, she'd take what was left of him, too. Ethan turned back to the screen. "There's more. Look at this." Another message appeared, this one an email chain between Cassandra and Mark Hamilton. It was short but clear. Mark had confirmed the legal steps needed to finalize the transfer. Her response was precise, cold. "After Sophia's wedding, everything will be wrapped up neatly." I stared at the words, unable to breathe for a moment. Ethan leaned back. "That's it. The timeline. She plans to finish everything after the wedding, probably using the distraction to her advantage." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. So in less than 48 hours she'd make her move. "We can't wait," Ethan said quietly. "We need to intercept whatever she's planning with Hamilton." I looked at him, searching for something solid, something to hold on to. "What do we do?" He closed the laptop gently. "We gather more evidence. There's got to be a full version of this will somewhere, maybe in Mark's possession or hers, and we need to find the final schedule for their meeting." I stood slowly, feeling the energy in the room shift. Part of me wanted to run straight to my father to tell him everything, but another part knew Cassandra would twist it before he could even process it. She was too skilled at deception. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We're not going to let her win." I nodded, but the fear didn't leave. Later, when Ethan had gone back to his room to dig deeper into the encrypted files, I stepped out onto the balcony. The resort lights glittered against the dark ocean, beautiful but somehow hollow. I thought about all the years my father had trusted Cassandra. How easily she had smiled at him tonight. How gently she had touched his arm. I wondered if he ever truly saw her, or only the illusion she wanted him to see. I stayed there a long time, the breeze cool against my face, until my phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Found another file. "Meeting scheduled tomorrow night. Valencia Grand. Private suite. MH, confirmed." I stared at the screen. Tomorrow night. That was when she'd close the trap. And if we didn't move first, it would be too late. The next evening, the rehearsal dinner was set in a private dining hall overlooking the ocean. Golden light from the sunset streamed through the glass walls, casting long reflections across the tables dressed in white linen. Guests were seated in clusters, laughter echoing softly through the room as waiters glided between them with trays of wine and perfectly plated seafood. I sat at the far end near my father, but my attention kept drifting toward Cassandra. She was radiant as always, dressed in a sleek champagne gown, greeting people with that effortless charm. She leaned down to whisper something to my father, and he smiled at her, that quiet, trusting smile that made my chest ache. I waited for the right moment, then excused myself from the table. I walked to where she was standing near a display of champagne flutes. Cassandra noticed me instantly, and her smile shifted ever so slightly, just enough for me to see the flicker of curiosity behind her eyes. "Olivia," she said smoothly. "What a lovely evening, isn't it?" I returned the smile, feigning ease. "It really is. I wanted to talk to you for a moment, just the two of us." Her brows lifted slightly, but she gestured gracefully toward a quieter corner of the room. We stepped away from the crowd, the hum of conversations fading behind us. "I know things between us have been distant." I began, careful with my tone. "But I want us to at least have some understanding. For Dad's sake." Her lips curved into a soft smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Understanding is always a good thing. I tilted my head, letting a hint of vulnerability show. "He trusts you so much. I just want to be sure he's protected." Her smile lingered, but her voice dropped silkier, heavier. "Olivia, you're young, ambitious. But sometimes ambition can lead people to places they shouldn't go. You should remember where your place is in this family." I felt the tension coil in my stomach. "And where would that be?" Her gaze sharpened slightly, though her tone remained calm. "By your father's side, of course, supporting him, not creating unnecessary disruptions. It would be a shame to make decisions you might regret later." The threat was quiet, almost polite, but it hung in the air like a blade. I didn't flinch. I simply nodded once, masking the rush of anger under my skin. She tilted her head, almost amused. Anyway, I won't be around much longer. There's so much waiting for me in Manhattan. The penthouse is finally ready. The words slipped out so naturally, I almost missed them. My breath caught for just a second. Manhattan. A penthouse. She was already planning her life after she took everything. Before I could respond, my father approached, breaking the moment. Cassandra turned to him, her expression instantly warm, her hand lightly brushing his arm. I stepped back, forcing myself to stay composed as she led him back toward the guests. Later that night, I met Ethan in the quiet lounge of the resort. He was already waiting with his laptop open. I told him everything, every word she had said, every look. "She threatened you," Ethan said flatly. "And she slipped about a penthouse in Manhattan. That's confirmation she's planning her exit." I sat down across from him, my hands clasped tightly. We can't just confront her. She'll deny everything, twisted around, and Dad will believe her. We need proof. Something undeniable. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we set the trap. We make her show her hand. We spent the next hour sketching out the plan. The wedding day was the perfect cover. The hotel would be full of guests, staff distractions. Cassandra would feel safe. Too safe. We would plant discreet cameras in the suite where she was scheduled to meet Mark Hamilton. Audio recorders hidden in plain sight. Madison Clark, the investigative journalist I knew from a past case, could help us verify the trail and be a neutral party when the time came. I hesitated before calling Madison. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk but curious. "Olivia." "It's been a while. I didn't waste time." I told her about Cassandra, about the forged will, about the offshore accounts. There was a brief silence, then Madison's tone hardened. "You're telling me Cassandra Hale, the one who reinvented herself as the perfect wife, is running the same play she used in Miami?" My grip on the phone tightened. Miami. Madison exhaled. Years ago, she disappeared after cleaning out a wealthy real estate developer there. It was quiet, settled privately. He died shortly after. No one could prove anything, but everyone in the right circles knew it was her. I closed my eyes, anger pulsing through me. "So this wasn't the first time." "I need your help," I said. "I need someone who knows how she operates." Madison didn't hesitate. "I'll be there tomorrow morning. If she's repeating her game, I'll help you expose her." I hung up and looked at Ethan. "She's done this before. She lured a man in Miami and vanished after taking everything." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we don't have time to wait. We get everything we can tomorrow." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. Tomorrow was the wedding. Tomorrow was also the day Cassandra planned to meet Mark and finish what she started. As I walked back to my room, I glanced across the lobby. Cassandra was there, standing at the bar with a glass of wine in her hand. She was laughing at something a guest said, her expression light, easy, flawless. But for just a second, her eyes shifted. She saw me. And in that glance, I thought I saw it again. The calculation. The awareness that the game was almost over. I turned away and kept walking. Tomorrow we will be ready. The morning sun spilled over the cliffs of La Jolla, lighting the resort in a soft haze. I barely slept. My phone buzzed just after 8, and when I saw the name, a rush of relief washed through me. Emily Brooks had arrived. Emily had been my mother's closest friend, a quiet and perceptive woman with a sharp memory for the past. She met me in the Courtyard Cafe, dressed in a simple beige coat, her silver hair pulled back neatly. The years had added lines to her face, but her eyes were the same kind, but always observing. "Olivia," she said, taking my hands warmly. "I'm so sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances." I nodded, sitting across from her. "You know something about Cassandra, don't you?" Emily sighed and reached into her bag. "I don't just know something. I know enough to tell you this isn't new." She slid an envelope across the table. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were glossy photos. Cassandra, 5 years younger, but unmistakably her in a sleek black dress, laughing with Mark Hamilton in what looked like a New York rooftop bar. Another photo of them entering a hotel together, their hands brushing like people who shared more than business. My chest tightened. "So they've been connected that long," I whispered. Emily nodded gravely. They were inseparable for a time. Back then she went by another name, Carla Bennett. She worked her way into a real estate mogul's life in Miami. Vincent Keller. He was much older, worth hundreds of millions. She convinced him to move several properties into her control. Weeks later, she disappeared. He died of a stroke 6 months after. No one could tie anything to her. I felt the air around me still. It was like hearing a ghost story, except the ghost was very much alive and sitting across from my father every night. Emily's voice softened. "Your mother never trusted her. Before she passed, she told me if Richard ever remarries, it will be someone who sees him as a wallet, not a man." I swallowed the lump in my throat. And now she's doing the same thing to him. Emily's gaze held mine. "You can't confront her without proof that even Richard can't ignore. She is too good at twisting the truth." I nodded, my mind racing. "We're gathering evidence. Ethan is helping me. But now I know she has a history with Mark." Emily touched my arm gently. "Be careful. She's dangerous when cornered." Before I could respond, I caught movement from the lobby beyond the glass. Cassandra. She had just stepped in speaking with one of the hotel managers. Her eyes swept the cafe casually, but when they landed on me and Emily, there was a flicker of something sharp. She tilted her head slightly, smiled faintly, then walked toward the elevators. My stomach dropped. She had seen us. Emily followed my gaze. "She knows you're digging." Later that afternoon, I went back to my room to regroup with Ethan. But when I opened the door, something felt off. My suitcase was slightly shifted. The closet door was ajar when I had left it closed. I froze. Someone had been in here. Ethan arrived minutes later. I told him what I noticed. He frowned, checking the room carefully. "She's starting to suspect you," he said quietly. "If she didn't find anything this time, she'll keep looking." My phone buzzed again. It was a message from Madison Clark, who was already in San Diego. She had dug deeper into Cassandra's past. It matched what Emily had said. Cassandra, or Carla Bennett, as she was known then, had a pattern. Miami. Then a wealthy widower in Chicago. Each time she left with money clean and quiet. Ethan sat down at the desk, pulling up his laptop again. "I'm going back into her schedule. If she's escalating, the final meeting with Mark has to be soon." I paced the room as he worked. Every second felt heavier. After 20 minutes, Ethan leaned back. "Found it. Tomorrow night. Private suite, same floor as the wedding reception. The subject line says final documents." My heart pounded. Tomorrow night. The night before the wedding. Ethan's eyes were steady. "That's when she'll sign whatever she's planned with Mark. It's her endgame." I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the timeline sinking in. Less than 24 hours. Ethan crouched in front of me, his voice calm but firm. "We have one shot to catch her in the act. Cameras, audio, and someone who can verify what's happening." "Madison," I said. "She can be there discreetly. She'll know how to document it." Ethan nodded. "Then we move tomorrow." As I exhaled slowly, my gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the sky was turning a deep orange, the ocean reflecting the last light of the day. It was beautiful, but it felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. Somewhere in the hotel, Cassandra was probably preparing her next move, smiling at my father, making him believe she was his salvation. And tomorrow night, she would try to take it all. But this time, someone would be watching her. The evening before the wedding glowed with an unsettling kind of perfection. The Valencia Grand was dressed in gold and white, the entire resort humming with quiet excitement. Guests floated through the marble halls in gowns and tuxedos, soft music spilling from the grand piano in the lobby. Everywhere I looked, there were smiles, laughter, and the false ease that comes before something big. I stood near the entrance to the ballroom, taking it all in. Cassandra moved through the crowd with flawless grace, her hand looped through my father's arm. He looked proud, content, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. She leaned in close to whisper something in his ear, and he chuckled softly, his shoulders relaxing the way they always did around her. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. He still believed she was everything she pretended to be. When they passed me, Cassandra caught my gaze. Her smile was warm, perfect for the people watching, but her eyes lingered for just a second longer than necessary. I saw the message hidden there, the unspoken warning that she was still in control. Ethan stepped quietly beside me. "It's time," he murmured. We slipped away from the main reception down a quiet hallway that led to the smaller conference suites reserved for private meetings. Madison was already there, waiting, a slim black bag slung over her shoulder. She nodded once, her face set with professional calm. The suite was empty, pristine, smelling faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. Ethan unpacked the tiny cameras and audio recorders, his movements swift and practiced. I watched him secure a pin-sized camera into the base of a decorative lamp and another just above the corner molding. Madison helped adjust the audio device under the table where Cassandra and Mark would sit. We worked quickly, the clock ticking down. As I tucked a small recorder behind the frame of a large painting, I heard footsteps echoing faintly down the hallway. My heart stopped. Ethan froze. "Someone's coming." Madison gestured sharply for silence. We waited. The door opened just an inch, and Cassandra's voice drifted in, soft and lilting. "I thought I saw someone in here earlier." My pulse raced. She couldn't see us yet, but she was only a step away. Before she could push the door open further, laughter erupted behind her. 2 wedding guests came down the hallway calling her name. Cassandra paused, then turned, her tone instantly bright. "Oh, I was just checking the room, making sure everything's perfect." They chatted briefly, and I could hear her voice moving further away. I exhaled slowly. Madison's eyes met mine, calm but sharp. "We finish now." Within minutes, everything was in place. We slipped out of the suite, quietly blending back into the flow of guests. Later that night, the tension inside me grew heavier. The ballroom was alive with chatter and music. Guests toasted to Sophia and her fiancé, the perfect picture of happiness. I stood near the back, pretending to listen as Benjamin made small talk with a senator. Then I saw her. Cassandra slipped away from the ballroom, gliding down the hallway toward the private suites. She didn't notice me watching. Ethan moved into position, his phone ready to monitor the live feed from the hidden cameras. Madison stood nearby, her phone angled just slightly, her face calm but focused. We waited in the quiet lounge across the hall as Cassandra entered the suite. Through Ethan's laptop screen, I saw her settle into one of the chairs, her movements smooth and confident. Moments later, Mark Hamilton arrived. He closed the door behind him, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Cassandra greeted him with a soft laugh, the kind reserved for someone more than just a colleague. She pulled out a white envelope from her clutch and set it on the table between them. "You're sure everything is ready?" she asked. Mark opened the briefcase, revealing several documents. "Absolutely. Once you sign this, there's no going back." He glanced toward the door. "Tomorrow morning, it'll be done." Cassandra leaned forward slightly. "Good." She tapped the envelope with her manicured fingers. "Here's your advance." She handed it to him, and even through the grainy camera view, I saw the thickness of the cash inside. Then her voice, cool and precise, filled the audio. "By this time tomorrow, it will all be finished. I'll have full control over Carter Real Estate. Richard will never know until it's too late." I gripped the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood. Mark smiled faintly. "You're really going to disappear after this?" Cassandra's lips curved. "Once the assets are transferred, I'm done here. Manhattan is waiting." Ethan's jaw tightened as he stared at the screen. "We've got it." Madison's voice was calm, almost detached. "That's the confession you needed." I couldn't speak. I just watched the woman who had played my father so easily hand over his life's work like it was hers to take. When Mark stood to leave, Cassandra followed him toward the door. The camera caught one last glimpse of her adjusting her gown, her face serene, triumphant. Then the door closed, leaving the room empty again. Ethan shut the laptop. "It's all there. Audio, video, her words. We have enough to bury her." I nodded slowly, but the ache in my chest didn't ease. It wasn't just about stopping her anymore. It was about protecting my father from the moment he would realize what she really was. Madison checked her watch. Tomorrow morning is the ceremony. By then, she'll think she's won. I took a deep breath. Then tomorrow is the day she falls. The morning sun broke over the Pacific in soft streaks of gold spilling light across the resort. By the time I stepped into the grand ballroom, it had been transformed into a fantasy. White roses from Italy climbed in delicate spirals up towering crystal columns. Chandeliers glittered like falling stars, and the aisle was lined with silk petals that looked too perfect to be real. The scent of the imported flowers lingered in the air, heady and sweet, like something out of a dream you didn't quite trust. 300 guests filled the space, each more polished than the last. Senators, tech magnates, actors flown in from Los Angeles, even a foreign dignitary. Sophia's fiancé's family knew. Photographers circled quietly, snapping photos for glossy magazines and social media. There was a low hum of luxury in everything, from the champagne served in gold-rimmed glasses to the soft music performed by a string quartet flown in from Florence. I stood off to the side in a pale silk dress, watching it all with a quiet detachment. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also the perfect mask. Everyone believed this was a day of celebration of love. Only a handful of us knew what was really about to unfold. Sophia appeared at the end of the corridor, radiant in her custom-made gown, rumored to cost nearly $1 million. The dress shimmered like water under the morning light, every pearl and crystal sewn by hand. Guests gasped softly as she walked in her veil, trailing like a cloud. The ceremony had officially begun. But my eyes weren't on Sophia. They were on Cassandra. She was seated near the front next to my father, dressed in a pale lavender gown that clung to her frame like liquid. She smiled sweetly at the guests, who whispered compliments to her, nodding graciously, as if she were the queen of the moment. My father, as always, looked proud, his hand resting lightly on hers. He had no idea that the woman he trusted was preparing to steal everything from him. As the officiant began speaking, Cassandra turned slightly, her eyes scanning the room. Then, just for a moment, her gaze landed on me. I was holding my phone in my hand, checking a message from Ethan, who was somewhere in the back monitoring the equipment. I saw the flicker in her eyes. For a split second, her serene mask cracked just barely. She tilted her head, her smile still in place, but there was a flash of something sharp. Suspicion. She knew I was watching her again. But then, almost as quickly, she smoothed her expression and turned back toward the ceremony. In her mind, she still believed she was in control. She thought she had already won. I glanced toward the far side of the ballroom. Ethan was standing near a set of discreetly hidden speakers, his phone in hand. Madison was a few feet away, blending in with the photographers, her camera bag holding more than just lenses. Ethan caught my eye across the room, a subtle nod. Then he looked down at his screen. I checked my phone. A single message from him lit the screen. "It's ready." My pulse quickened. This was it. The moment we couldn't reverse. I put the phone down, inhaling slowly, trying to steady myself as the vows began. Sophia's voice trembled slightly with emotion, and her fiancé squeezed her hand, smiling at her with genuine love. For a fleeting second, I felt a pang of guilt that their day would soon become the backdrop for something far darker. But I reminded myself what was at stake. My father's life's work, his dignity, the truth. I watched Cassandra carefully. She leaned back slightly, a picture of elegance and composure, her fingers brushing the diamond bracelet at her wrist. She whispered something to my father, and he smiled, completely oblivious. Guests dabbed their eyes as the officiant pronounced Sophia and her husband married. Applause rippled through the room, music swelled, and the couple kissed under a rain of soft petals. Cameras flashed like starlight, capturing the perfect moment. But for me, everything seemed to slow down. I could feel my heartbeat loud in my ears. I could see Ethan's hand hovering over his phone, ready. Madison shifted subtly, her camera aimed, but not clicking. Cassandra rose with the rest of the guests, clapping softly, her smile wide. She glanced back at me one more time as if to savor her imagined victory. And then Ethan sent me another message. "We're live in 60 seconds. I exhaled slowly, feeling the air leave my lungs like a weight I'd been carrying for too long. My eyes locked on Cassandra, and for the first time all morning, I let myself imagine the look that would cross her face when the world saw what she had done. The orchestra began playing, as the newlyweds made their way back up the aisle, guests following them toward the reception hall. The noise in the ballroom swelled with laughter, the clink of glasses, the buzz of conversation. I slipped through the crowd toward Ethan, my phone still in my hand. He glanced at me and gave a barely perceptible nod. Everything was set. The video was cued. Once it started, there would be no stopping it. The reception hall glittered with light as the guests moved in waves, raising their glasses to Sophia and her new husband. Laughter rippled through the room and the string quartet played a soft waltz in the corner. Waiters carried trays of champagne that sparkled under the chandeliers, and the giant LED screen behind the head table flashed a slideshow of the couple's photos. I stood at the edge of the room with a glass of champagne in my hand, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. My heart pounded so hard it felt almost visible. Madison was already in position near the stage, her bag holding the printed emails and photos. Ethan was by the tech booth, one finger hovering over his phone to trigger the feed. Cassandra sat at the center table, her lavender gown flawless, her diamond earrings catching the light. She was laughing softly at something one of the guests said, her hand resting lightly on my father's. He smiled at her, like he always did, gentle, trusting. I took a step toward the stage, weaving through the crowd. My fingers gripped the stem of the glass too tightly. I lifted it high, my voice steady, but carrying just enough to draw attention. "To Sophia and Daniel, may your future be as beautiful as today." The guests turned toward me, smiling, some clapping lightly. Cassandra glanced back over her shoulder, her smile polite but tinged with curiosity. I lowered the glass slightly, my eyes locking on Ethan across the room. A tiny nod. The room dimmed for just a second as the slideshow on the LED screen flickered. A murmur rose from the guests. Then the first image appeared. Not of Sophia. Not of the wedding. It was a close-up of Cassandra sitting in the hotel suite, handing a thick envelope of cash to Mark Hamilton. The sound filled the hall crystal clear. "By this time tomorrow it will all be finished. I'll have full control over Carter Real Estate. Richard will never know until it's too late." Gasps broke through the music. Someone whispered loudly, "What is this?" The video continued. Cassandra and Mark discussing the final steps, her voice calm, confident. The camera zoomed slightly to show the fake wills spread out on the table. Mark's voice followed. "Once you sign this, there's no going back." Guests froze, some covering their mouths. The murmuring grew louder, a low tide of confusion and disbelief. I glanced at Cassandra. Her face had gone pale beneath the perfect makeup. Her eyes darted to my father, then back to the screen. "Stop it," she hissed, her voice sharp but quiet. But the video kept playing. Cassandra again, her words like poison. "Once the assets are transferred, I'm done here. Manhattan is waiting." A loud ripple of shock swept through the room. People started standing, some stepping back. Richard, my father, stared at the screen, his face draining of color. His hand shook slightly as he braced himself against the table. "No." His voice cracked, barely audible. Cassandra shot up from her chair. "This is nonsense. Lies. Someone has edited this." But before she could take a step, Madison stepped forward. She held up printed emails, photos, and bank transfer records. "These are originals," she said calmly, her voice carrying. "Verified by timestamps. And these," she held up the photos, "are from New York 5 years ago. Cassandra Hale and Mark Hamilton. Not business partners, lovers." The room erupted. Guests whispered louder, some pulling out their phones to take pictures. My father looked at Cassandra again, confusion turning into something deeper. "Pain. You forged my signature, didn't you?" His voice trembled. Cassandra froze, her mouth opening, but no words coming out. Then the screen flickered to another document, the Cayman Islands account with her name attached. Wire transfers spanning months. The noise in the room turned into chaos. Someone gasped loudly. Someone else muttered that they knew she was too perfect. Cassandra's mask shattered. She lunged toward the tech booth, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Stop this right now." Ethan stepped in her path before she reached the booth. Calm but firm. "It's too late, Cassandra. Everyone has seen it." She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "You did this." I didn't look away. Richard stood slowly, his face hollow. "How could you?" he whispered. "After everything." Cassandra's voice cracked. "Richard, it's not what it looks like. I was doing this for us, to protect you." But no one believed her anymore. The silence that followed was louder than the chaos. She spun toward the screen, frantic. "Enough! Turn it off!" She lunged again, but Ethan blocked her, his hand steady. "No," he said quietly. "You're done." And for the first time, Cassandra looked small. The confidence drained from her posture, replaced with raw panic. She glanced around the room, but there was no one left on her side. The screen behind her froze on the final image, Cassandra holding the forged will. Smiling faintly as Mark Hamilton looked on, the truth hung in the air, undeniable in front of every single guest. Cassandra's breathing turned sharp and uneven as she backed away from the screen, her eyes darting wildly for any escape. She turned suddenly and made for the side entrance of the reception hall, pushing past stunned guests who instinctively stepped aside. Her gown snagged briefly on a chair, but she yanked it free, her composure fully gone. I followed her with my eyes, my body frozen for a second. Then I moved. She wasn't going to disappear quietly. "Stop her!" someone shouted, but Cassandra was already at the double doors, her heels echoing like gunshots on the polished floor. Before she could push through, two uniformed hotel security guards appeared from the corridor. They blocked the exit, their expressions firm but calm. "Ma'am, we need you to remain here," one of them said evenly. "Get out of my way!" Cassandra snapped, her voice shaking. "You don't know who I am." The guard didn't budge. "We've been asked to secure this area." Behind her, the guests were no longer whispering. They were murmuring openly, some taking photos, others shaking their heads in disbelief. My father was still by the head table staring at her as if the woman in front of him was a stranger. Cassandra turned her face, twisting between anger and panic. "Richard, tell them to let me go." My father didn't speak. His shoulders slumped as if something inside him had broken. I saw her expression falter for the briefest moment. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she had lost her grip on him. Then her phone rang. She snatched it from her clutch, her voice lowering into a frantic whisper. "Mark, where are you? You need to get me out of here now." But she didn't realize Ethan was already moving toward her. He glanced at me once before speaking into his earpiece quietly. "She's calling him. Get ready." Across the city, Mark Hamilton had no idea his escape route was already collapsing. Ethan stepped closer to Cassandra, calm, collected. "Don't bother. He won't help you. The police already have him on their radar." She froze, her phone still pressed to her ear. "You're bluffing," she hissed. Ethan shook his head slowly. "We're not. They're already tracking his calls." Her hand trembled. The color drained from her face, but she forced a laugh that sounded more like a gasp. "This is ridiculous!" "You can't prove anything," she said, but the cracks in her voice betrayed her. "Everything is on that screen." Madison spoke up, stepping forward from the crowd. She held up a sealed envelope. "And I have the originals authenticated." The room grew even quieter. Then another voice rose from the back, firm and commanding. "I can confirm that." All heads turned. Judge Karen Wells, a family friend and one of the most respected probate judges in San Diego County, stepped through the crowd. She had been invited to the wedding as a guest, but now her calm authority filled the room. She walked toward my father and placed a hand gently on his shoulder before turning to Cassandra. "This is forgery, fraud, and in this state what you attempted is a criminal offense." Cassandra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Wells continued, her voice like steel. "You orchestrated the falsification of a will, You conspired with an attorney to commit fraud. I don't need more context to tell you this is a prosecutable case. Guests gasped again, and the murmur swelled. Cassandra's last bit of composure unraveled. You don't understand, I was protecting Richard. I was? No, my father said quietly. His voice was soft, but carried through the silence. He looked at her with eyes that were suddenly older tired. You were protecting yourself. Cassandra's breath hitched. She turned toward him, desperation flaring. I love you. I did this for us. He shook his head slowly. You never loved me. You loved what I could give you. She took a step toward him, but the security guards moved closer. Before anyone could say more, the distant sound of sirens echoed faintly outside. Guests turned toward the large windows as red and blue lights flashed against the walls of the resort. Two uniformed San Diego police officers entered the hall, moments later their presence filling the room with a new kind of tension. Cassandra Hale, one of them asked, scanning the crowd. She froze, her eyes wide. The officer stepped forward. We have a request to detain you for questioning on suspicion of fraud and attempted embezzlement. No, Cassandra whispered, shaking her head. This is a mistake. You can't do this here, not like this. It's already done, Madison said, her voice calm. The officers approached. Cassandra tried to back away, but the guards flanked her. One officer gently took her arm, reading her rights clearly and evenly. The crowd parted like water, leaving a clear path toward the door. As they guided her through the room, the whispers turned into an audible wave. People shook their heads, some took photos, others simply stared with a mix of shock and disdain. Cassandra's eyes darted wildly, looking for someone, anyone to help her. They landed on my father one last time. But he didn't move. He just looked down at the floor, silent. When she passed me, her gaze sharpened into something raw. Rage. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Then she was gone, escorted out the same door she had tried to escape through minutes earlier. Outside, the sirens faded into the distance. Inside, the silence was thick and suffocating. My father sat back down slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. Benjamin was the first to move, placing a steady hand on my father's shoulder. Guests began to murmur, but no one dared to break the heavy silence that had settled over the reception hall. My father finally lifted his head, his eyes distant, hollow. I saw the moment the weight of betrayal sank in. He stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket as if trying to regain a semblance of control. His voice was quiet, but carried enough strength for everyone to hear. This wedding is over for me. Please continue celebrating for Sophia and Daniel. I need to take some time. He stepped away from the table and I followed him out of the room. In the quiet hallway, away from the noise of the shaken guests, he stopped and leaned against the wall. I'm sorry, Dad, I said softly, my chest tightening at the sight of him. He shook his head slowly. You have nothing to be sorry for. You saved me. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that would ease the pain in his eyes. Over the next 48 hours, everything moved like a storm. Cassandra was taken into custody and held for questioning. The San Diego Police Department coordinated with financial crimes investigators who quickly uncovered the offshore accounts and the trail of forged documents. Mark Hamilton didn't get far. The same night Cassandra was arrested, he tried to board a private plane out of John Wayne Airport. He was intercepted by law enforcement before the aircraft even left the tarmac. I later learned he had been carrying multiple passports and an unregistered phone. Ethan kept me updated on every detail. His calm voice was the anchor I didn't realize I needed. A day after Cassandra's arrest, my father called a private family meeting at the resort. His expression was composed, but I could see the quiet exhaustion in his eyes. I'm removing any pending changes to the will immediately, he said firmly. Cassandra will have no claim to anything. He looked at me, then his gaze softening slightly. I am sorry I didn't see her for what she was. You trusted her, I said gently. She was good at hiding who she really was. He nodded, pausing as if thinking deeply. I've also decided something else. Hale Properties will remain intact, but I'm creating a foundation in your mother's name. A portion of the estate will go toward a charity for women and children in need. It's what she would have wanted. My throat tightened. I felt a rush of emotion hearing him speak her name again after so long. That evening, Ethan and I walked along the beach outside the resort. The air was cooler, the ocean calm. For the first time in days, there was no immediate threat hanging over us. "You were incredible," I said quietly. "I couldn't have done this without you." He smiled faintly, the setting sun reflecting in his eyes. "You didn't need me to be strong. You already were. I just helped you see it." I looked at him, the weight of the past week lingering in the space between us. I realized then that he had always been there, steady, even when I didn't see it. We stood there for a while, the silence easy, the tension that had built over the years, loosening into something quieter, something hopeful. Meanwhile, Madison had already begun her work. She published an exposé on Cassandra Hale the following morning, complete with screenshots of the emails, copies of the forged will, and a detailed account of her history in Miami and Chicago. The story spread fast, picked up by major outlets, and circulated through social media like wildfire. Cassandra's carefully curated reputation in high society shattered overnight. Within days, her spa empire in Beverly Hills was in freefall. Business partners severed ties, investors pulled out, and clients canceled memberships in droves. Photos of her being escorted out of the wedding in handcuffs were plastered everywhere. No one wanted to be associated with her name. I watched the fallout unfold, a strange mix of relief and quiet sorrow lingering in me. She had chosen her path, and now she was facing the consequences. At my father's home in Los Angeles a week later, I found him sitting in his study surrounded by family photos. He looked up at me, the faintest trace of a smile returning to his face. "It's over now," he said softly. I nodded. "Yes, it is." But deep down, I knew this was more than just the end of Cassandra's deception. It was the start of something different for all of us. In the weeks that followed, the noise around Cassandra faded into the background of headlines and gossip columns. Her name became a cautionary tale in circles that once praised her charm. The photos of her being escorted from the wedding were printed in magazines that used to celebrate her style. People whispered about her fall from grace at dinner parties, shaking their heads at how quickly a life built on deceit could unravel. At home in Los Angeles, the Hale estate felt different. Lighter somehow. My father was quieter at first, spending long hours in his study, staring at old photographs of my mother. One evening, I found him sitting in the garden, the same place she used to tend roses. He looked up at me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw him not as the powerful man everyone respected, but simply as my father. "I was blind, Olivia," he said, his voice low. "I wanted to believe there could be love again. I wanted it so badly that I didn't see who she really was." I sat beside him. "You're human, Dad. Trust isn't a weakness, but sometimes it can be dangerous in the wrong hands." He nodded slowly, the weight of regret softening into something gentler. "I owe you more than I can ever say. You saved me even when I didn't want to see the truth." In the days that followed, Sophia and Benjamin stopped by the house. Sophia hugged me tightly, her eyes bright with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered. "You saved more than just Uncle Richard. You saved all of us from being part of her lies." Benjamin smiled faintly, his tone calm but sincere. "You kept the wedding from becoming a complete disaster. Sophia and Daniel still have their day, and that's because of you." I realized then that exposing Cassandra hadn't just been about saving the family fortune. It was about protecting the memory of what my mother and father built together, the values that were supposed to hold this family together long after she was gone. The charity foundation my father announced was finalized weeks later. The Elizabeth Hale Foundation, named for my mother, would support women and children escaping abusive situations. It felt like a full-circle moment, a way to bring something good out of all the pain. Ethan stayed by my side through it all. One quiet evening after we finished going over the final legal filings to close Cassandra's claims, we sat in the living room with coffee, the atmosphere finally calm. "You know you didn't just save your father," Ethan said softly. "You saved yourself, too." I looked at him, meeting his steady gaze. "Maybe. Or maybe you reminded me I didn't have to do it alone." A small smile curved his lips. "You never do." There was no need for more words. Something unspoken passed between us, a quiet understanding that whatever came next didn't have to be faced in solitude. Meanwhile, Madison's article continued to ripple through the city. Cassandra's network of business partners dissolved completely. Her spa empire shut down within a month, investors pulling out faster than she could respond. She was left with nothing but her reputation in ruins, her face no longer welcome in the elite circles she once ruled. Justice didn't come in a courtroom. It didn't need to. The truth had been enough to strip away the mask she had worn for so long. I often found myself thinking about how easily trust can be twisted when someone is skilled enough at playing the part. Cassandra had worn love like a costume, convincing even the sharpest minds that she was genuine. But in the end, no matter how carefully she planned, the truth had its way of surfacing. Standing in the study one late afternoon, I looked at my mother's portrait. I felt a calmness I hadn't known for years. Sometimes justice doesn't need a judge or a jury. Sometimes the simple act of revealing the truth is the heaviest sentence of all. So if you ever wonder whether secrets can stay buried forever, remember this. Every scheme, every lie, every betrayal eventually faces the light. And when it does, there is no escape from the consequences. If you have ever doubted that the truth matters, let this remind you that no matter how deeply it is hidden, it always finds its way out. Because every plot, every deception, every mask will one day fall. And if you have ever wondered whether those who betray will face their reckoning, remember this. Every secret has its moment, and every betrayal has its price. If you want to hear more stories like this, stay with me. Because in the end, no matter how dark the plan, every hidden truth will always have its day.